The first blast shook the walls before anyone could even shout a warning. Dust fell from the ceiling, like gray snow, and the lights inside the outpost flickered twice before steadying. Grace Bennett dropped to her knees beside a wounded man, pressing a cloth to his shoulder while her hands trembled. She had trained for moments like this, but nothing could prepare a person for the real sound of an attack landing close enough to feel in your chest. Outside, Daniel Ashford stood at the edge of the outpost wall, watching smoke rise from the tree line half a mile away. He was the commander of this small post, a quiet stretch of land that had once been peaceful farmland before the fighting spread this far. He raised his binoculars and scanned the horizon, jaw tight, eyes narrow. What he saw made his stomach drop. Dozens of vehicles were rolling toward them, kicking up dust that stretched far into the distance. "Command," he said into his radio, keeping his voice steady, though his heart pounded. "We have a large force, approaching from the east. I need numbers on reinforcements." Silence answered him, not even static, just dead air. He tried again, adjusting the frequency, tapping the side of the radio, like that might fix whatever was broken. Nothing. The line had been cut, or jammed, or maybe destroyed entirely somewhere along the route. Either way, they were alone. Oliver Hunt, the young radio operator, came running out of the communication room, his face pale. "Sir, all our channels are down. I tried every backup line we have." Daniel lowered the binoculars slowly. "Every one?" "Every one," Oliver said. "It's like someone wants us cut off from the rest of the world." The outpost held about 40 people. Some were soldiers, trained and armed, ready for whatever came next. Others were civilians who had sought shelter here weeks ago when their villages became too dangerous to stay in. Farmers, teachers, a few children who still didn't understand why they couldn't go home. Daniel had promised all of them safety. Now that promise felt impossibly heavy. He turned to his second-in-command, a broad-shouldered soldier named Marcus Doyle, who had been with him for 3 years now. "Get everyone into the shelter rooms, weapons ready, but only if it becomes necessary. I want calm, not panic." Marcus nodded and moved quickly, calling out orders as he went, guiding frightened civilians toward the reinforced rooms beneath the main building. Children clutched their mothers' hands, eyes wide with fear they were too young to hide. An elderly man leaned on his cane, moving as fast as his legs allowed, while a young girl helped steady him. Grace finished bandaging the wounded soldier and rushed to help the others. She had joined this post against her family's wishes, choosing to serve as a field medic instead of staying home where it was safe. Her mother had begged her not to go. Her father hadn't spoken to her for a week before she left. But Grace believed that skills like hers were needed most exactly in places like this. And now, watching the fear on every face around her, she understood why she had made that choice. The first wave of attackers reached the outer fence within the hour. Warning shots rang out, followed by shouted commands, followed by silence that felt far more dangerous than noise. Daniel watched from the wall as the enemy force paused just outside firing range, clearly studying the outpost, sizing it up, deciding how best to break through. "They're testing us," Marcus said, crouching beside him with his rifle ready, "trying to see how strong our defenses are before they commit everything." "Then we make sure they think twice," Daniel replied. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Their defenses were thin. They had enough supplies for maybe 2 weeks if they were careful, enough ammunition for a handful of serious confrontations, and no way to call for help. The people surrounding them outnumbered the outpost soldiers many times over, and reinforcements, if they were coming at all, had no idea this post even needed saving. As evening fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and a cold wind swept across the open ground between the outpost and the tree line. Daniel walked the perimeter, checking on his soldiers, offering quiet words of encouragement where he could. He stopped beside a young private named Ethan Cole, barely 20 years old, who had only been stationed here for 2 months. "You holding up?" Daniel asked. Ethan tried to smile, though it came out shaky. "I keep thinking about my sister back home. She doesn't even know I'm out here, Told her I had a normal desk job. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. Focus on tonight. Worry about explaining things to her later. Ethan nodded, gripping his rifle a little tighter. Inside the shelter rooms, Grace moved between the civilians, checking on the wounded, offering water to the children, trying to keep everyone calm despite the distant sound of engines and shouted orders drifting through the walls. An older woman named Margaret Foley sat with two young boys pressed close against her sides. She had lost her husband months earlier in the fighting that had forced her from her home, and now she held on to these two boys, neighbors' children whose parents hadn't made it out in time, as if they were her own. "Will we be safe here?" one of the boys whispered. Margaret glanced at Grace, who offered the gentlest smile she could manage. "The soldiers outside are very brave," Grace said. "They are doing everything they can to protect us." It wasn't a full answer, but it was the only comfort she had to offer. Outside, night fully settled over the outpost, and with it came a heavier stillness, the kind that made every sound feel sharper. A twig snapping in the distance, wind pushing against loose metal somewhere on the roof, the occasional cough or shuffle of feet among the nervous soldiers standing watch. Then, just past midnight, the silence broke. Gunfire erupted from the tree line, sudden and overwhelming, lighting up the darkness in short, bright flashes. Daniel dropped low behind the wall, shouting orders as his soldiers returned fire, the outpost's defenses coming alive in a chaos of noise and motion. Marcus moved along the line, directing soldiers to key positions, his voice cutting through the confusion with practiced calm. "Hold the east corner," he shouted. "Ethan, watch your flank." Ethan fired from his position near the fence, hands steady, despite the fear pulsing through him. Beside him, another soldier, named Lucas Bryant, reloaded quickly, covering his section without hesitation. They had trained together for this exact scenario more times than they could count, yet nothing about drills had prepared them for how loud, how real, how terrifying an actual attack could feel. The exchange lasted nearly 20 minutes before the attacking force pulled back, retreating into the darkness as suddenly as they had appeared. Silence returned, heavier than before, broken only by the ragged breathing of soldiers catching their breath and the distant sound of Grace tending to a soldier who had taken a graze along his arm. Daniel climbed to his feet slowly, scanning the field ahead. No bodies from his side. A few wounded, none critical. For now, they had held. But he understood exactly what had just happened. That attack hadn't been the real assault. It had been another test, a way to measure response time, defensive strength, weak points along the perimeter. The real attack was still coming, and when it did, the outpost would need far more than steady nerves and careful positioning to survive it. He returned to the communication room, where Oliver sat hunched over the radio equipment, still trying every possible frequency, every backup channel, anything that might reach beyond the static that surrounded them. "Anything?" Daniel asked. Oliver shook his head, exhaustion clear on his face. "I don't think anyone even knows we're here anymore, sir." Daniel stared at the dark equipment for a long moment, thinking of the 40 people counting on him, the children hiding in the shelter rooms, the soldiers standing watch through the freezing night. He thought about how easily hope could slip away in a place like this, how quickly the belief that help was coming could crumble into the certainty that no one was coming at all. He picked up the radio microphone one final time before dawn, adjusting the dial to the widest possible range, casting the signal out into the darkness, like a message in a bottle, thrown into an endless ocean. "This is Outpost 7, he said, his voice low but firm. "We are under attack. Civilians present, requesting any available support. If anyone can hear this, please respond." Static answered him, endless and empty. He set the microphone down slowly, unsure if his words had traveled anywhere at all, unsure if this desperate call would ever reach a single living soul beyond these walls. Outside, the first hint of gray light touched the horizon, revealing the tree line where the enemy force waited, patient and unseen, gathering strength for what was surely coming next. Daniel stepped back out into the cold morning air, looking at the tired faces of his soldiers, the frightened eyes peering out from shelter room windows, the empty stretch of land between his people and everything that threatened them. Whatever happened next, he understood there would be no easy answers, no quick rescue arriving over the horizon. They were alone, truly alone, and the only thing keeping this small outpost standing was the stubborn will of everyone inside it to see another sunrise. The signal Daniel sent into the static that morning carried further than he could have ever imagined, though he would not learn this for many hours yet. Somewhere far above the outpost, beyond the clouds and beyond the reach of ordinary radios, a piece of equipment far more advanced than anything at the outpost caught a fragment of that desperate transmission and began the long process of relaying it toward people who might actually be able to help. But for now, all Daniel knew was silence, and the growing certainty that this fight, whatever shape it took, would be one his small group of soldiers and civilians would have to face entirely on their own. 3 days passed, and each one felt longer than the last. The outpost had settled into an uneasy rhythm of watching, waiting, and rationing whatever supplies remained. Water had to be measured carefully now, food stretched thin across 40 hungry mouths, and every soldier took turns standing watch through shifts that left them exhausted by morning. Daniel Ashford moved through the compound with a calm exterior, but underneath it, worry gnawed at him constantly. The enemy had not launched another full assault since that first night, yet they hadn't left either. Their vehicles remained parked along the tree line, engines occasionally rumbling to life, as if reminding everyone inside the outpost that they were still there, still watching, still waiting for the right moment. Grace Bennett spent her days moving between patients, checking wounds, comforting frightened children, and trying to maintain some sense of normal routine despite the circumstances. She had started teaching the 2 boys staying with Margaret Foley simple lessons during the quiet hours, using an old notebook and pencil stub she found in a supply crate. It gave the boys something to focus on, besides the fear pressing down on everyone, and it gave Grace a small purpose beyond her medical duties, something to hold on to that reminded her why she had chosen this life in the first place. "You're very patient with them," Margaret said one afternoon, watching Grace explain a simple math problem to the younger boy. Grace smiled faintly. "My little sister used to struggle with numbers too. I used to help her the same way." "Do you miss home?" Margaret asked gently. Grace paused, glancing toward the window where sunlight filtered weakly through dust-covered glass. "Every day, but I made a promise to myself that I would go wherever I was needed most. Right now, that's here." Margaret reached over and squeezed her hand. "These boys are lucky to have you. We all are." Outside, Marcus Doyle checked the perimeter fence for the 3rd time that day, inspecting weak points and reinforcing them with whatever scrap materials he could find. Ethan Cole and Lucas Bryant worked alongside him, hauling metal sheets and wooden beams to patch gaps that had formed from the earlier confrontation. It was hard, sweaty work, made harder by the constant awareness that enemy eyes were likely watching every move they made from the distant tree line. "You think they're waiting for something specific?" Ethan asked, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool air. Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "Could be waiting on more soldiers of their own. Could be waiting for us to run out of supplies and weaken ourselves without them lifting a finger. Either way, patience seems to be their plan right now." Lucas hammered a nail into place, his expression grim. "Our patience is running out faster than theirs, though. We've got maybe a week of food left if we're careful." Nobody responded to that. They all knew it was true, and saying it out loud only made the weight of it heavier. That evening, Daniel called a small meeting with his senior soldiers inside the main building, spreading a worn map across the table and pointing to their location, isolated and surrounded on almost every side. Marcus stood across from him, arms crossed, listening carefully. Oliver Hunt sat nearby, still monitoring the radio equipment even during the meeting, unwilling to miss even a second of possible contact. "We need a plan beyond simply holding out," Daniel said. "If reinforcements aren't coming, we need to consider other options. Evacuation routes, however limited they might be." Marcus shook his head slowly. Every route out of here runs straight through territory they control. We wouldn't make it a mile with civilians in tow, especially with wounded among them. Then we hold, Daniel said, though the words felt heavier each time he spoke them. We hold, and we hope that signal reached someone. Oliver looked up from the radio, dark circles forming beneath his tired eyes. I've tried every frequency I know, sir. I even attempted some of the older emergency channels that haven't been used in years. Nothing has come back yet. But I haven't given up. I won't. Daniel nodded, grateful for the young man's determination, even as doubt crept steadily through his own thoughts. That night, the temperature dropped even further, and a thin layer of frost covered the ground by morning. Grace woke early, checking on her patients before the rest of the outpost stirred. One of the wounded soldiers, a quiet man named Tobias Wren, had developed a slight fever overnight, and she worked carefully to bring it down, using the limited medical supplies they had left. As she worked, she overheard hushed voices near the shelter room entrance and turned to find Ethan and Lucas discussing something in low, urgent tones. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping closer. Ethan hesitated before answering. "We spotted movement near the southern ridge overnight. Looked like they might be setting up something new. Marcus went to check it out himself." Grace felt her stomach tighten. "Setting up what?" "We don't know yet," Lucas admitted. "Could be nothing. Could be something we really don't want it to be." An hour later, Marcus returned, his expression darker than Grace had ever seen it. He found Daniel near the command post and pulled him aside, speaking quietly enough that only a few nearby soldiers caught fragments of the conversation. "They've brought in heavier equipment," Marcus said, "something that wasn't there before. If I had to guess, they're preparing for a larger push, something meant to break through our defenses completely, rather than just testing us." Daniel absorbed this information silently, his mind racing through every possible response, every scenario that might keep his people alive if that larger push came. None of the options felt strong enough. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Hard to say for certain," Marcus replied. "A day, maybe two if we're fortunate." The news spread quietly through the outpost over the following hours, not through official announcement, but through the natural way fear travels among people living in close quarters, under constant threat. Civilians grew quieter, soldiers grew more alert, and an unspoken tension settled over everyone, like a heavy blanket that couldn't be shaken off. Grace found herself sitting with Margaret and the two boys that evening, trying to maintain some sense of calm, despite everything swirling around them. The younger boy, barely 7 years old, looked up at her with wide, worried eyes. "Are the bad soldiers going to hurt us?" he asked quietly. Grace knelt down to his level, choosing her words carefully. "There are very brave people protecting us. They are doing everything they possibly can to keep everyone safe. Your job right now is just to stay close to Margaret and try to rest. Can you do that for me?" The boy nodded slowly, though fear still clouded his young face. Grace squeezed his shoulder gently before standing, glancing toward Margaret, who offered a small, grateful nod in return. Later that night, unable to sleep, Grace made her way to the command post, where she found Daniel standing alone, staring out at the dark tree line where danger waited patiently for its moment. "You should be resting," he said without turning around. "So should you," she replied, stepping up beside him. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the distant shapes of enemy vehicles, occasionally illuminated by flickers of light from their camps. "Do you think help is coming?" Grace finally asked. Daniel considered the question seriously before answering. "I have to believe it is, not because I have proof, but because believing anything else means giving up, and I refuse to do that while there are people counting on us." Grace nodded, finding a small measure of comfort in his steady conviction, even if uncertainty still gnawed at both of them beneath the surface. Meanwhile, far beyond the outpost, in a location none of them could have imagined, Daniel's desperate transmission from days earlier had finally reached ears capable of understanding its full weight. A satellite operator, working a routine overnight shift, had noticed an unusual signal fragment buried within standard data, something that shouldn't have been there, something carrying the unmistakable pattern of a distress call. Curious and cautious, she flagged it for further review, setting off a chain of events that would eventually reach a specialized international response unit trained for exactly this kind of impossible situation. Back at the outpost, however, none of this was known yet. Daniel and Grace remained standing at the wall, watching the darkness together, unaware that somewhere far away, the first steps toward their rescue had already quietly begun. Morning arrived with an unsettling stillness. The soldiers took their positions along the perimeter as they had every day before, but there was a different quality to the air, a heaviness that seemed to press down on everyone equally. Marcus moved along the defensive line, double-checking weapons and ammunition, speaking quiet words of encouragement to soldiers who needed it most. Ethan stood near the eastern fence, gripping his rifle tightly, eyes fixed on the tree line where shapes occasionally moved between the trunks, gathering, preparing. Around midday, the enemy force began advancing, slowly at first, testing the boundaries of the outpost's remaining defenses. Daniel watched through his binoculars, counting vehicles, estimating numbers, trying to calculate exactly how long his people could realistically hold against what was coming. The math never worked in their favor, no matter how many times he ran through it. "Positions!" Marcus shouted, and soldiers scrambled into place, along the fence line, weapons ready, hearts pounding. Grace hurried the last of the civilians into the shelter rooms, ushering Margaret and the two boys inside, before turning back to check for anyone who might have been left behind. Satisfied everyone was secure, she grabbed her medical bag and moved toward the forward positions, ready to treat whoever needed her next. The enemy advance stopped just short of firing range once again, that same maddening pattern of pressure without full commitment, testing nerves without triggering the final confrontation everyone dreaded. Daniel understood this was deliberate, a way of wearing down his people's resolve slowly, rather than risking heavy losses in a single decisive strike. It was working. He could feel exhaustion and fear settling deeper into everyone around him with each passing hour of uncertainty. As the sun began sinking toward the horizon, Oliver burst out of the communication room, nearly stumbling in his excitement, his face lit with something Daniel hadn't seen in days, genuine hope. "Sir," Oliver called out, hurrying toward the command post. "I picked up something. A response. It was brief, but it was real. Someone heard us." Daniel felt his heart leap, though he kept his expression carefully controlled, unwilling to let hope override caution just yet. "What did it say?" "Just a few words, before the signal broke apart again," Oliver said, breathless. "But I heard it clearly. They said help is coming." The words spread quickly through the outpost, carried from soldier to soldier, whispered among civilians huddled in the shelter rooms. For the first time in days, something other than fear moved through the compound. It wasn't certainty, not yet, but it was something the outpost desperately needed, a reason to keep holding on just a little longer. Far from the outpost, in a heavily guarded command center built into the side of a mountain, a team of specialists moved with practiced urgency through corridors lined with humming servers and glowing screens. This was the headquarters of an international rescue unit, known informally as Earth's Warriors, a small but highly skilled group assembled from multiple countries and trained specifically for missions considered too dangerous or too remote for standard military response. They had been called upon before, in situations others deemed impossible, and each time they had found a way through. The commanding officer of Earth's Warriors was a sharp-eyed woman named Naomi Clark, whose calm exterior hid years of hard-earned experience leading soldiers through operations that most people would never hear about. She stood at the center of the command room, studying a large display showing satellite imagery of the outpost and the surrounding terrain, her expression focused and unreadable. "Talk to me," she said, turning toward her intelligence officer, a thoughtful man named Felix Turner, who had been analyzing the fragmented distress signal since it first arrived. "The transmission confirms a civilian and military presence at Outpost 7, Felix explained, pulling up additional data on the screen. Based on satellite imagery, we're looking at a substantial hostile force surrounding the location, likely numbering in the hundreds, compared to a defending group we estimate at under 50, including civilians. Naomi studied the numbers carefully. Any idea how much time they have left? Hard to say precisely, Felix admitted. But based on troop movements we've tracked over the last several hours, I'd guess a major assault could happen within the next day or two, possibly sooner. Naomi turned to the rest of her assembled team, standing ready around the room. The pilot assigned to lead the aerial insertion was a steady, experienced man named Gabriel Hart, who had flown more rescue missions than he could easily count, though none of them had ever left him fully at ease with the risks involved. Beside him stood a squad leader named Victor Kane, broad-shouldered and serious, known throughout the unit for his unwavering focus during high-pressure operations. "This is going to be a difficult insertion," Naomi said, addressing the room. "We're looking at hostile territory, minimal intelligence beyond satellite imagery, and a closing window before that outpost is overrun. I won't pretend this is a simple mission, but there are civilians down there, including children, and soldiers who have held their position against overwhelming odds for days now. We are not leaving them to face this alone." Gabriel studied the terrain map carefully, mentally calculating flight paths, potential landing zones, and the various obstacles standing between his aircraft and a safe approach to the outpost. He had lost someone close to him on a mission similar to this one, years earlier, when a rescue attempt had gone wrong at the final moment. That loss had never fully left him, and though he rarely spoke of it, it shaped every decision he made in situations exactly like this one. "I can get us close," Gabriel said, "but we'll be flying through contested airspace with minimal cover. If they've got anything capable of reaching us in the air, this becomes significantly more dangerous." "Understood," Naomi replied. "We move forward regardless. Prepare your teams. We depart within the hour." As the room shifted into motion, soldiers checking equipment, pilots reviewing flight paths, medics preparing supplies, Victor approached Naomi quietly, his expression serious. "You remember the last time we attempted something on this scale," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. Naomi met his gaze steadily. "I remember, but we learned from it, and we're not the same team we were then." Victor nodded slowly, though the weight of past losses clearly lingered behind his eyes. He turned and moved toward his squad, gathering them together to review final details before departure. Meanwhile, back at the outpost, the atmosphere had shifted subtly since Oliver's brief message reception. Hope, however fragile, had given everyone a renewed sense of purpose. Daniel moved through the compound, checking on soldiers and civilians alike, offering steady reassurance even as uncertainty continued gnawing quietly beneath the surface of his calm exterior. Grace worked tirelessly among the wounded, her movements efficient despite exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders. She paused briefly beside Margaret and the two boys, offering a soft smile that carried more confidence than she fully felt inside. "Someone heard us," she said gently. "Help might really be on the way." The older boy looked up at her with cautious optimism. "Will they get here before the bad soldiers attack again?" Grace hesitated only slightly before answering. "We have to believe they will, and until then, we keep being brave, just like we have been." Outside, Marcus continued reinforcing the perimeter fence alongside Ethan and Lucas, though their movements now carried a different energy, driven less by desperation and more by determination. If help truly was coming, they intended to hold this position long enough for it to arrive. As night fell once more, Daniel called another meeting inside the command post, this time with a renewed sense of strategy rather than simple survival. Oliver sat nearby, still monitoring the radio equipment closely, hoping for another fragment of contact that might confirm exactly when rescue would arrive. "If reinforcements are coming, we need to be ready to support their arrival," Daniel said, studying the map spread across the table. "That means securing a clear area where they can safely approach and making sure our own defenses hold long enough to give them that opportunity." Marcus traced a section of the map with his finger. The open field north of the outpost would be our best option. Wide enough for an aerial approach, close enough that we could reach it quickly if needed. Daniel nodded, though concern remained clear in his expression. That field sits dangerously close to enemy positions along the tree line. If they see activity there, they'll understand exactly what we're preparing for. Then we make sure they don't see it until it's too late, Marcus replied firmly. They spent the following hours refining their plan carefully, considering every possible complication, every way the enemy might respond if they sensed rescue efforts approaching. Despite the exhaustion pulling at everyone involved, a quiet determination settled over the group, the kind that comes only when people finally have something concrete to work toward, rather than simply enduring whatever came next. Hundreds of miles away, Earth's warriors prepared for departure with practiced efficiency. Gabriel completed his final flight checks, running through mental calculations of fuel, distance, and timing with careful precision. Victor gathered his squad near the aircraft, reviewing insertion points and contingency plans one final time before boarding. Naomi walked among her team, offering brief words of confidence to soldiers preparing for what everyone understood would be an extremely dangerous mission. She paused beside a young soldier named Oscar Bennett, barely into his second year with the unit, checking his equipment with steady hands despite obvious nervousness. "First major deployment?" Naomi asked gently. Oscar nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, ma'am. I won't let the team down." Naomi placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Trust your training. Trust the people beside you. That's all any of us can do once we're in the air." As the aircraft engines roared to life, the team boarded quickly, securing equipment and taking their positions for what would be a long, tense flight toward hostile territory. Gabriel guided the aircraft skyward, watching the ground fall away beneath them as they began the difficult journey ahead. Inside the cabin, Victor reviewed the mission details one final time with his squad, ensuring everyone understood their roles clearly. "We insert under cover of darkness, secure a perimeter around the outpost's northern field, and coordinate directly with the defending forces to organize a controlled evacuation. Speed and precision matter more than anything else tonight." The soldiers nodded, checking their equipment methodically, faces set with focused determination, despite the danger waiting ahead. Back at the outpost, tension continued building as another night settled over the compound. Daniel stood watch near the northern field they had identified as a potential landing zone, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, any indication that rescue might finally be approaching. Beside him, Grace held a small flashlight, ready to signal if needed, her nerves steady despite the uncertainty pressing down on everyone. "Do you really think they'll come tonight?" she asked quietly. Daniel considered the question carefully. "I think if they're coming at all, it has to be soon. We can't hold much longer without something changing." As if responding directly to his words, a faint sound reached their ears from somewhere far in the distance, barely audible at first, growing steadily louder as several long minutes passed. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the unmistakable rhythm of approaching aircraft engines cutting through the night sky. "Grace," he said urgently, "get everyone ready. I think this is it." Word spread quickly through the outpost, soldiers scrambling into position along the defensive line, civilians gathering nervously near the shelter room entrances, uncertain whether to feel hope or fear at the sound growing louder above them. Marcus joined Daniel near the northern field, both men straining to see through the darkness as the aircraft sound intensified. "That's definitely not enemy equipment," Marcus said, recognizing the distinct engine pattern from his own military experience. Daniel felt a surge of cautious hope building inside his chest, though years of hard lessons kept him from fully trusting the moment until he could see clear proof with his own eyes. Then, cutting through the darkness above them, the first shapes became visible against the star-filled sky, descending steadily toward the outpost with careful precision despite the danger surrounding their approach. Daniel watched, breath held, as the reality of the moment finally settled over him. Earth's warriors had arrived, but even as hope surged through the outpost, Daniel understood the danger was far from finished. The enemy force surrounding them would certainly notice this approaching aircraft, and their response, whatever shape it took, was likely to be swift and severe. The real fight, the one that would determine whether this rescue succeeded or failed entirely, was only just beginning. The aircraft descended quickly, cutting through darkness with practiced precision as Gabriel guided them toward the northern field Daniel and Marcus had identified earlier. Inside the cabin, Victor gave final instructions to his squad, voice calm despite the tension building around them. Once we're on the ground, secure the perimeter immediately. Priority is establishing contact with the defending forces and beginning evacuation preparations for the civilians. Move fast, move together. The soldiers nodded, gripping their equipment tightly as the aircraft leveled out for final approach. Below them, the outpost's defensive lights flickered against the darkness, marking the location where dozens of lives hung in uncertain balance. Almost immediately, warning signals lit up across Gabriel's control panel. Enemy forces along the tree line had noticed the approaching aircraft and were responding quickly, redirecting attention away from their patient siege and toward this sudden new threat descending from above. "We've got incoming resistance," Gabriel called back to the cabin. "Brace for a rough landing." Bright flashes erupted from the tree line as anti-aircraft fire streaked upward, forcing Gabriel to adjust his approach sharply, weaving the aircraft through the darkness with practiced skill despite the danger surrounding them. Inside, soldiers held tight to their harnesses, trusting completely in their pilot's ability to navigate them safely through the chaos. On the ground, Daniel watched with growing alarm as gunfire erupted from the tree line, illuminating the night in sharp bursts of light. "They're targeting the aircraft," he shouted to Marcus. "We need to draw their attention away, give them a clearer path to land." Marcus immediately began directing soldiers toward the eastern perimeter, opening fire toward the tree line in a coordinated effort to distract the enemy force from their focus on the descending rescue aircraft. Ethan and Lucas moved quickly into position, adding their fire to the effort, doing everything possible to buy precious seconds for the approaching rescue. Grace remained near the shelter rooms, keeping civilians calm despite the chaos erupting around them. Margaret held the two boys close, whispering reassurance even as her own hands trembled with fear. The younger boy buried his face against her side, unwilling to watch the flashes of light and sound filling the darkness outside. Above the outpost, Gabriel fought to maintain control as another burst of enemy fire streaked past dangerously close to the aircraft's hull. "Almost there," he called back through gritted teeth, adjusting his approach one final time as the landing zone came into clearer view below them. The aircraft touched down hard against the field, soldiers immediately spilling out and moving into defensive positions around the landing zone. Victor led the charge, directing his squad with practiced efficiency as they established a secure perimeter despite continued fire from the distant tree line. Daniel rushed forward to meet them, relief and urgency mixing together in his expression as he reached the newly arrived soldiers. "Commander Daniel Ashford," he said quickly. "We've got civilians and wounded that need immediate evacuation." Victor nodded firmly. "Squad leader Victor Kane, we're here to help get everyone out safely. How many are we looking at?" 40 total, Daniel replied, "including children and several wounded who can't move quickly on their own." Victor turned to his squad, issuing rapid instructions. "Begin evacuation immediately. Medical team, prioritize the wounded. Everyone else, form a protective corridor between the shelter rooms and the aircraft." The soldiers moved with practiced coordination, guiding frightened civilians from the shelter rooms toward the waiting aircraft while maintaining defensive positions against continued enemy fire from the distance. Grace worked alongside the newly arrived medical team, helping transport wounded soldiers as quickly and carefully as possible, despite the chaos surrounding them. Margaret guided the two boys through the organized chaos, gripping their hands tightly as soldiers formed a protective barrier around the fleeing civilians. The younger boy stumbled slightly, and a nearby soldier scooped him up gently, carrying him the rest of the way toward safety without breaking stride. As the evacuation continued, enemy forces began pressing harder against the outpost's weakened defenses, sensing perhaps that this represented their final opportunity before their intended target slipped entirely beyond reach. Marcus and his soldiers held their positions along the perimeter, exchanging fire steadily as they worked to protect the ongoing evacuation efforts. "We need more time," Marcus shouted toward Daniel, who remained near the landing zone, coordinating the final stages of civilian transport. Daniel turned toward Victor urgently. "Can your team hold the perimeter a little longer? We still have wounded that need to reach the aircraft." Victor nodded firmly, already moving to reinforce the defensive line alongside his own soldiers. "We hold as long as necessary. Nobody gets left behind tonight." Together, soldiers from the outpost and Earth's warriors fought side by side, holding their combined defensive line against increasingly aggressive enemy pressure, while the last of the civilians and wounded were carefully loaded aboard the waiting aircraft. Gabriel remained at the controls, engines running steadily, ready for immediate departure the moment evacuation was complete. Grace helped load the final wounded soldier aboard, checking vital signs quickly before securing him safely for transport. She turned back toward the chaos still unfolding near the perimeter, searching for any sign of Daniel or Marcus among the soldiers still holding their defensive positions. "Everyone accounted for?" Victor called out, moving quickly between positions to confirm the evacuation's progress. "All civilians and wounded are aboard," Grace shouted back, relief evident in her exhausted voice. Victor immediately began pulling his remaining soldiers back toward the aircraft, maintaining careful coordination to avoid leaving anyone exposed during the final withdrawal. Daniel and Marcus moved with the retreating group, still exchanging fire with pursuing enemy forces as they closed the distance toward safety. Just as the last soldiers reached the aircraft, a sudden explosion erupted near the perimeter, close enough to knock several people off balance. Daniel stumbled, but caught himself quickly, glancing back to ensure everyone remained accounted for despite the chaos. "Go, go, go!" Marcus shouted, pushing the final soldiers aboard the aircraft as Gabriel prepared for immediate takeoff. The aircraft doors sealed shut just as enemy fire intensified around the departing landing zone, and Gabriel lifted off quickly, banking sharply to avoid further danger as the ground fell away beneath them. Inside the cabin, exhausted soldiers and relieved civilians caught their breath, the tension of the evacuation slowly beginning to release from tightly wound shoulders and clenched hands. Grace moved carefully through the crowded cabin, checking on wounded passengers and offering quiet reassurance to frightened children, still processing everything that had just happened. Margaret held the two boys close, tears of relief finally falling freely now that immediate danger had passed. Daniel found a seat near the front of the cabin, allowing himself a rare moment to simply breathe, the weight of days spent holding an impossible position finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. Marcus settled beside him, equally exhausted, both men silently processing the reality that they had actually survived what seemed impossible only hours earlier. "We made it," Marcus said quietly, almost disbelieving his own words. Daniel nodded slowly, glancing around the cabin at the exhausted but safe faces surrounding them. "We made it because people we didn't even know decided we were worth saving." Victor approached, offering a firm handshake to both men. "Your people held that position against odds. Most soldiers wouldn't have survived. That takes real courage." "We just refused to give up," Daniel replied simply. As the aircraft continued its journey away from the danger they had left behind, Naomi's voice came through the cabin's communication system, confirming their safe departure from hostile territory and providing updated coordinates for their final destination, a secure location where medical treatment and proper rest finally awaited everyone aboard. The immediate danger had passed, but as Daniel looked around at the exhausted faces surrounding him, he understood that the full impact of everything they had endured together was only just beginning to settle in. Survival, he realized, was only the first step. What came next, processing loss, rebuilding lives, finding meaning after such an ordeal, would take considerably longer than any single night of rescue could accomplish. The aircraft landed at a secure medical facility just before dawn, and exhausted passengers began filing out slowly, blinking against the early morning light after days spent in near constant tension and fear. Medical staff rushed forward immediately, guiding wounded soldiers and civilians toward waiting stretchers and treatment stations set up specifically for their arrival. Grace remained close to her patients throughout the transfer, providing detailed updates to the receiving medical team despite her own overwhelming exhaustion. Margaret guided the two boys off the aircraft carefully, both children clinging tightly to her hands as they stepped onto solid ground for the first time in what felt like an eternity. A kind-faced nurse knelt down beside them, offering warm blankets and gentle words of comfort as she led them toward a quiet area set aside for displaced children and their guardians. "You're safe now," the nurse said softly. "Nobody is going to hurt you here." The younger boy looked up uncertainly, still processing everything that had happened over the past several days. "Is it really over?" The nurse smiled gently. "It's over. You did so well staying brave through all of it." Nearby, Daniel stood quietly, watching the organized chaos of arrival unfold around him, still struggling to fully accept that the ordeal had truly ended. Marcus approached, offering a tired but genuine smile. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Marcus said. "After everything, just standing here safely." Daniel nodded slowly. "I keep expecting something to go wrong. Guess it'll take time before that feeling fades." "It will," Marcus assured him. "Give it time." Across the facility, Naomi coordinated final logistics with her team, ensuring every rescued individual received proper medical attention and that accurate records were kept for the difficult work of reconnecting displaced civilians with distant family members who had likely spent days fearing the worst. Victor moved among his soldiers, checking on their well-being after the demanding mission, offering quiet words of appreciation for their courage and dedication throughout the operation. Gabriel remained near the aircraft, completing necessary post-flight procedures despite his own deep exhaustion. He paused for a moment, glancing back toward the facility where rescued civilians and soldiers continued receiving care, allowing himself a brief moment of quiet satisfaction. This mission had succeeded where memory of an earlier failure had haunted him for years, and though nothing could fully erase that old pain, tonight's success offered a measure of peace he hadn't expected to find. As morning light fully broke across the facility, Grace finally allowed herself a moment to rest, sitting quietly near a window overlooking the peaceful grounds outside. Daniel found her there, settling into the seat beside her, without a word at first, both simply grateful for the stillness after days filled with constant tension and fear. "You did incredible work back there," Daniel said eventually. "Every single person we brought out alive owes you something for that." Grace shook her head modestly. "I just did what needed doing, same as everyone else." "Still," Daniel said, "don't underestimate what that meant to the people you helped." Grace smiled faintly, allowing herself to accept the compliment despite her natural humility. "What happens now? For all of us, I mean." Daniel considered the question carefully. "Recovery, mostly. Physical and otherwise. The soldiers will likely receive new assignments eventually, though some may need time before they're ready for that. The civilians will need help rebuilding, finding new homes, reconnecting with family members who've been searching for them." "And you?" Grace asked. "What happens for you?" Daniel paused, considering the question with unusual uncertainty. "I honestly don't know yet. I suppose I'll take things one day at a time, same as everyone else." Over the following days, the facility buzzed with quiet activity as rescued individuals slowly began the process of recovery and reconnection. Margaret worked closely with facility staff to help locate family members for the two boys she had protected throughout the ordeal, eventually learning that distant relatives had indeed survived the earlier fighting and were desperately searching for any news of the children's whereabouts. The reunion, when it finally happened, brought tears of overwhelming relief from everyone present, a small but meaningful victory amid the larger tragedy that had unfolded around them. Ethan finally managed to contact his sister, explaining as gently as possible the reality of what his supposed desk job had actually involved. Though shocked and worried, she expressed nothing but pride and relief that he had survived, promising to visit as soon as circumstances allowed. Lucas spent his recovery time quietly reflecting on everything the outpost had endured, finding unexpected strength in the bonds formed among soldiers who had faced impossible odds together. Oliver received special recognition for his persistent efforts maintaining communication attempts throughout the crisis, his determination directly responsible for the eventual rescue that saved dozens of lives. He accepted the acknowledgement with characteristic modesty, insisting that any credit belonged equally to everyone who had refused to give up hope during those darkest hours. Naomi and her team eventually returned to their mountain headquarters, already beginning preparations for whatever future missions might require their particular skills. Victor took time before departure to personally thank Daniel and Marcus for their leadership throughout the crisis, acknowledging the remarkable courage required to hold an impossible position for as long as they had. "Your outpost held longer than most would have believed possible," Victor said during their final conversation before Earth's warriors departed. "That's not something easily forgotten." "We had help arrive exactly when we needed it most," Daniel replied. "That's not something we'll forget either." Gabriel, before departing alongside his team, sought out Grace specifically, wanting to personally acknowledge her tireless dedication throughout the crisis and subsequent evacuation. "Whatever you decide to do next," he told her, "know that you made a genuine difference for everyone you helped. That matters more than you probably realize." Grace thanked him sincerely, touched by the unexpected recognition from someone who had witnessed firsthand the chaos and danger of that rescue mission. As weeks passed, life slowly began settling into new patterns for everyone touched by the events at Outpost 7. Some returned to previous assignments, carrying forward lessons learned during those harrowing days. Others chose different paths entirely, forever changed by the experience of facing seemingly impossible odds and somehow emerging on the other side. Daniel eventually accepted a new assignment, though he carried the memory of Outpost 7 with him permanently, a constant reminder of both the terrible dangers his soldiers faced regularly and the remarkable capacity people had for courage under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. He maintained contact with several soldiers from that mission, including Marcus, who eventually transitioned into training new recruits, sharing hard-earned wisdom from his own experiences to better prepare the next generation of soldiers for whatever challenges awaited them. Grace continued her work as a field medic, though she requested reassignment closer to civilian relief efforts specifically, feeling drawn toward helping displaced families rebuild their lives after experiences similar to what she had witnessed at the outpost. She often thought of Margaret and the two boys, occasionally receiving updates on their progress as they settled into their new life with relatives who cherished having them home safely. Margaret herself found unexpected purpose in advocating for displaced children within her community, using her own experience protecting the two boys during their ordeal to help establish support systems for other families facing similar circumstances. The boys, meanwhile, slowly began healing from their frightening experience, finding comfort and stability in their new surroundings, while never fully forgetting the brave soldiers and dedicated medic who had kept them safe during those uncertain days. Months later, a small gathering took place at a quiet community center, bringing together many of those who had survived the ordeal at Outpost 7, alongside members of Earth's warriors who had made their rescue possible. It wasn't a large or formal event, simply an opportunity for people whose lives had intersected during such an intense crisis to reconnect and acknowledge everything they had shared together. Daniel stood near the entrance, watching familiar faces mingle together, exchanging stories and laughter that would have seemed impossible during those darkest hours at the outpost. Grace approached him, smiling warmly as she gestured toward the crowded room, filled with survivors and rescuers alike. "Hard to believe how far everyone has come since then," she said. Daniel nodded, watching Margaret laugh alongside the two boys, now noticeably more relaxed and confident than they had been during their time at the outpost. Nearby, Ethan chatted animatedly with his visiting sister, clearly relieved to finally share his experiences openly, rather than hiding behind careful half-truths about his actual work. "It's strange," Daniel said thoughtfully. "Something so terrifying eventually led to moments like this. People finding strength they didn't know they had, connections that probably wouldn't have formed any other way." Grace considered his words carefully before responding. "Maybe that's the only way anything good comes from something so difficult. People choosing to hold on to hope, even when everything around them suggests giving up, might be easier." Across the room, Naomi and Victor spoke quietly with several outpost soldiers, discussing potential future collaborations between their organizations, recognizing the value of maintaining connections built through such intense shared experience. Gabriel stood nearby, listening with quiet satisfaction, finally feeling that old weight of past failure, lifting more fully with each successful mission added to his experience. As the gathering continued into the evening, stories were shared, gratitude expressed, and new friendships solidified among people who would likely have never crossed paths under ordinary circumstances. The terror of those days at Outpost 7 remained a permanent part of everyone's memory, but so too did the remarkable courage, sacrifice, and eventual rescue that had followed. Late that night, as the gathering finally began winding down, Daniel found himself standing alone near a quiet window, reflecting on everything that had unfolded since that first desperate radio call, sent into empty static so many months earlier. He thought about how easily that outpost could have fallen, how close they had come to believing no help would ever arrive, and how everything had changed the moment Earth's warriors appeared against the night sky. Grace joined him quietly, following his gaze toward the peaceful darkness outside. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Daniel considered the question for a long moment before answering. Just how easily things could have gone differently. How close we came to losing everything. "But we didn't," Grace said gently, "because people refused to stop believing help was possible, even when the odds seemed impossible." Daniel nodded slowly, finding genuine peace in her simple but powerful observation. Whatever challenges awaited them in the future, whatever new difficulties life would inevitably bring, tonight served as a powerful reminder that even in humanity's darkest, most desperate moments, hope and courage could still triumph against seemingly impossible odds. Outside, stars filled the clear night sky above them, steady and constant, much like the quiet strength that had carried everyone through those unforgettable days when they thought no one was coming, until warriors fell from the sky and proved otherwise.